This is episode 16 of the Joyful Movement Show, and today I'm joined by a guest, Alissa Rumsey. Alissa is a registered dietitian, and she's here to talk about her new book, UnApologetic Eating, and what exactly that means. So stay tuned. Hi there. Welcome to the Joyful Movement Show. I'm your host, Kim Hagel, mom, recovering dieter, and founder of Radiant Vitality Wellness. As a personal trainer with my own story of body acceptance, I've seen firsthand how diet culture influences the fitness industry and the damage it causes the women I work with, keeping them on the start-stop cycle, struggling to find motivation. It's now my mission to empower women to break free from torturous exercise, restrictive eating, and body shame. Stick with me and I'll help you discover what moves you so that you can tap into that burning motivation deep inside yourself and experience joyful movement, peace with food, and feel confident in your own skin. Are you ready? Let's lace up our runners, pop the earbuds in, and go for a walk while we chat. Hello, friends. Welcome back to the Joyful Movement Show. It's Kim here, and if you're joining us for the first time, I am a personal trainer and registered holistic nutritionist on a mission to help women heal their relationship to movement and food and find confidence in their own skin. I'm really excited to be joined by a special guest on this episode. Alissa Rumsey is here to talk to us about Unapologetic Eating, which is the title of her new book. And before I tell you about Alissa and jump into the interview, I just have to say that I started reading this book, and honestly, it's one of the most interesting and compelling books I've read in a really long time. You know, food is our lifeblood, and eating is one of life's greatest joys, and yet it all seems so complicated. Am I right? Everyone has an opinion on what is good and bad and the healthiest way to eat and what's the right amount to eat, and then even who's allowed to eat certain foods without guilt and shame. Our culture is obsessed with food rules, and as such, it leaves us feeling pressured, confused, guilty, and ashamed if we don't or can't conform to them. I was immediately drawn in by the way that Alissa calls out and normalizes all those feelings while educating on the cultural and political roots of all the food rules and societal norms that we live under. My eyes were opened right from the introduction of the book, and it brought to light so many injustices while also offering practical tips and compassion to help us heal our relationship to food and, in the meantime, transform our whole life. So in this episode, Alissa and I are going to talk about how food can be this powerful entry point into exploring more about ourselves, our beliefs, our values, and what we truly want out of life. We're going to talk about how to tell if your eating style is indeed a diet, and what intuitive eating is and how it's different than other approaches to health and nutrition. And Alyssa's going to get into what exactly she means by unapologetic eating. She's going to talk a fair bit about the oppressive nature of dieting and how being unapologetic with our eating is actually a political move. And then finally, we get into why it's important to have a system of support as you heal your relationship to food and yourself. But before we begin, let me just tell you a little bit more about Alissa. Alissa Rumsey is a registered dietitian, nutrition therapist, certified intuitive eating counselor, and the author of Unapologetic Eating, Make Peace with Food and Transform Your Life. Alissa is passionate about advocating for women to reclaim the space to eat and live unapologetically. She is the founder of Alissa Rumsey Nutrition and Wellness, a weight-inclusive nutrition practice that offers virtual counseling and online programs to help people liberate themselves from dieting, cultivate a peaceful relationship to food and their bodies, and live a more authentic, connected life. Her expertise has been featured in hundreds of media outlets, and she speaks regularly at events, online trainings, and conferences around the country. She calls New York City home and spends her free time exploring the city's food scene and searching for patches of green space to sunbathe in. I found this interview with Alissa to be enlightening, educational, and empowering. I hope you enjoy hearing from her as much as I did. Hi, Alissa. Welcome to the Joyful Movement Show. I am so excited to have you here today to talk about your new book, Unapologetic Eating. I just started to read the introduction, and I mean, I have been sucked into what I have read so far. This is a really great read. And so I'm really excited that you'll be sharing some of your ideas with our listeners today.
Yeah, thank you so much. I'm excited to be here and chat with you more.
Great. Well, one of the first things that caught my attention when I started to read the introduction of your book, you shared this story of you eating this big pub sub. And I'm from Canada, so we don't have that here. But the visual that you gave was it's this big, giant, beefy sandwich, and you posted some pictures of you enjoying that sandwich on social media, and it prompted all of this reaction. So would you share a little bit about that with us and how that sort of inspired your idea for the book?
Sure. So yes, this was a couple of years ago, and I was in Florida at the time. And so Publix is a pretty famous Southern US grocery store. I'm from the Northeast part of the United States. So I had actually never been there, never had a pub sub, but I was with my partner who, has spent a lot of years in Florida. And he was like, "Oh my gosh, you've never had a pub sub. We have to get you one." And so we get these, and it's this big like sub sandwich, right? And I'm sitting there eating, and it's in Florida. And so I'm like sitting in a bikini, like hunched over, like not paying attention to anyone. I'm just like, this sandwich is so good. And unbeknownst to me, he was actually like snapping photos. And he showed me them after, and he was like, "You just were like so into the sandwich, I had to take photos." And he's like, "Do you mind if I share one of these onto my Instagram?" And I look at the photo and I was like, "Yeah, go for it. No problem." And then I was like, it actually like inspired a thought in my head of like, "Oh, wait, can I share this as well?" Because so I'm looking at these photos, and so I'm like hunched over in a bathing suit. My mouth is like wide open. I have like food on my face. I'm just like enjoying the sandwich. And it brought up, I had just had a conversation at that point, like a week or so before, with a client of mine who had emailed me to say, "Hey, have you watched Netflix new documentary, Salt, Fat, Acid, Heat yet?" And my client said to me, "I have never seen a woman on TV or in the movies or anything, social media, and especially a woman who, Samin, I always forget how to pronounce her name, Nosrin, who is not in kind of our culture's idea of like what a beautiful or like socially acceptable body is." Mm-hmm. And she's like, "I've never seen a woman, let alone a woman who doesn't fit like our culture's kind of ideal or like the TV ideal even, just eating and enjoying food and getting so much like joy and pleasure out of it and not justifying or explaining or apologizing for it." And so my client and I had had this conversation. And then of course I had gone and watched, some of the first episodes. And so this photo of me like brought that to mind. And so that was my like off the cuff caption, was just like, why don't we see more photos of women just like eating and enjoying food, actually eating it, and not, justifying of like, "Oh, this was a cheat day," or like, "Oh," explaining why they're eating what they're eating. And, within like a matter of hours, that post just like flew to the top of like most, comments and DMs I'd ever seen. Yeah. And I was getting a lot of like comments and messages from women mostly who, were saying I was so brave for posting this and telling me like, "Oh, I could never, post a photo of myself, like not looking, quote unquote, perfectly," right? Because I had like no makeup on, my hair's like thrown up. You can see like all my wrinkles and like food in my face. And so that was like interesting to me at first of like, oh, like this was something like, yeah, thinking back, okay, probably 5-10 years ago, I couldn't have posted this photo of myself either. Like I would have felt like, oh no, this isn't a good photo of me. But then also, what came out of this is people started sharing, photos of them eating, like women eating food, because cool. I kind of went down this rabbit hole of, because a colleague of mine, Linda Tucker, who's a intuitive eating counselor in the US, she commented and she's like, "Ooh, this is like," and she put hashtag women eating food. And I clicked on it. And this is just a few years ago on Instagram. There's only 3 photos that use that hashtag on all of Instagram.
Wow.
Yeah. And I was like, wait a second, like, this is really interesting. Meanwhile, side note, women eating banana had like thousands of photos using that tag. So just like, right. Like, interesting. I was like, this is really interesting. And I like started Googling, and you Google women eating food, all you see is like thin white women, sitting in front of a salad, usually not even eating it. And I was like, this is really interesting. And then in addition to that, so like the women eating food hashtag kind of took off for a little bit. And I started hearing feedback from, fat folks, and specifically a couple of colleagues of mine who are in larger bodies who were doing the same thing I did, right? Like posting a photo of themselves eating, no explanation, just posting it. And while I had been getting, me, who I'm white, I live in a straight size body, a lot of body privilege, I had been getting all these like, you're so brave, this is amazing. Meanwhile, fat folks were getting like, and my colleagues were like getting like, you're a bad influence, no wonder you're so fat, basically getting like bullied and trolled.
Yeah.
And it just really kind of like all of these things together, first of all, really made me aware of my thin privilege, but also really made me start to think about more about like the images that we all see on a daily basis, like throughout our whole life, and just the implicit messages that this sends about what is acceptable and who is acceptable, and what types of bodies are acceptable, and what types of, in this case, eating is acceptable or unacceptable, and what types of bodies are not represented, or what types of things are not represented. And that really, started me on, at that point, I was, doing a lot of work with, in the non-diet space and with intuitive eating and more weight inclusive work. But this really just, like I said, kind of went down this rabbit hole and started just peeling back more of the layers and like reflecting upon like, okay, why was this like considered so brave? And like, what are these messages that we're all getting? And so, and then that, ended up kind of over the years turning into what a lot of this book turned out to be.
Yeah. Oh, that's what I took from that first story too. When I read it, was just how loaded that one picture and that one caption was. Like, what a can of worms it opened about what is acceptable for women to eat and who is acceptable to eat certain things. And like you say, the fat phobia and the thin privilege that brought up, and what foods are okay to eat, what foods aren't. Like there was a lot in that photo, in that Instagram post. So love to unpack a little bit of that as we go along. So first of all, can you talk to me a little bit about good and bad foods and the needing to justify foods and be on a cheat day to justify certain foods? That's something that I hear often in my world, that certain things are healthy and certain things aren't. And, if we're going to be brave enough to post a picture of ourselves eating something quote unquote bad, there better be a good reason behind it.
Yeah. Well, I think, the good food, bad food binary that you just mentioned there's a lot of stuff wrapped up in that. But I think first thing that comes to mind to me is just food has become such like this moral, like there's this moral value, not just on the food, but on the person eating the food. And so, if you're eating quote good foods, then you're like a good person and you're like trying to be healthy and you're, doing these things. If you're eating bad foods, like, oh, you've been so bad, like you're a bad person, you've messed up, all of these things. So it's, really taken on. And that's why I honestly don't love using the words like healthy food and unhealthy food, because while yes, certain foods do have more nutrients than others, even healthy and unhealthy at this point have such like a moral judgment attached to them. And the problem with this is, many problems with this, but one of the problems with this is that, when we're thinking of foods in this very like all or nothing kind of like binary way, it doesn't leave any room for like nuance. It also ends up just triggering this like very binary way of like eating, of like either it's been like a quote good day and I feel great, or it's been a bad day because I ate this one thing that was bad. And then like, well, F it, I might as well keep going. And it like puts us on this, going back and forth from just one or the other. And there's just no gray area. You're not like able to kind of exist in this gray area of where we can eat a whole variety of foods. And it's not a moral judgment on our character. And it doesn't, quote, derail our progress or our health if we eat these quote bad foods. But yeah, that is very common. And I think, again, if we that this binary thinking is very common in our culture, and especially in cultures like white supremacist cultures. That's like this trait of just the binary all or nothing is very, very common. And I think it impacts us in like a whole myriad of ways, but also, underneath this is also the anti-fat bias, like the fat phobia that you mentioned of, well, if I'm eating these bad foods, I'm a bad person, I'm going to gain weight, being fat is bad, like all of these beliefs that are wrapped up in our culture around body size and morality as well.
Yeah. And so talk to me a little bit about that. Like there is so much wrapped up in our body image and just in our cultural beliefs about weight and health and how those are all intertwined. Can you help unpack that a little bit?
Sure. So, I think what's talked about a lot is like, okay, we live in this diet culture, right? This culture that really prizes thin bodies and, thinks fat bodies are bad or not as valuable, not as worthy. But I think, it's even for me, it's been really helpful to even zoom out more and understand more like, well, why is that? Like, where did this belief that like fat bodies are not good and thin bodies are better? Like, where did that come from?
Yeah.
And, I quote Sabrina Strings in my book. She's the author of Fearing the Black Body. And her book was really, really, made me rethink the way I think about this and just understanding more these historical and like Western culture, like these historical kind of things that happened to lead to these beliefs of like fat being good or fat being bad, thin being good. And again, it goes back to, kind of the anti-Black beliefs and hundreds of years ago when the slave trade, the transatlantic slave trade was starting, Europeans and Americans had to like find this way to be like, okay, how are we going to convince people that like, it's okay for us to do this to Black folks? And one of the ways they did that was by, marginalizing them and making them, because of their body size, be like, okay, well, fat is bad. And so like, these people are, and again, like this moral piece came into with like the Christianity at the time. And so basically like, that's really what's at the root is like these different systems of oppression, including like racism, patriarchal, like we live in this patriarchal society, right? Where like men have historically held and continue to hold like most of the power in society. And so that's like the sexism piece coming in as well of like, okay, in order for white men to stay on top, they have to like oppress these other groups of people. And so oppressing like Black people and people of color, oppressing Indigenous folks, oppressing women. And Naomi Wolf, I also quote Naomi Wolf and her book, The Beauty Myth, about how, she talks about dieting being like the greatest distractor. And, every time in like the last couple hundred years, every time women got more like access to power or were able to do more things, like another beauty and body standard kind of came into quote vogue. And like, now they have something to distract them again. Because I think with all of these things, often people hear like, wait, but like me wanting to be thin doesn't mean like I'm racist. And it's like, no, like at this point, that's not what we're, that's not like our conscious thought, but understanding these different systems and why, it helped the people in power if all the rest of us were not in our power. And when we don't trust ourselves around food, when we don't trust our bodies, we don't trust ourselves in a lot of other areas of our life. And when we're spending all this time, dieting and trying to maintain a certain size, and worried about like our appearance and how we look, we're not able to stand in our power, and we don't have like the time and energy to like fight these different systems of oppression. So I think this was really a big turning point for me, again, as someone with a lot of body privilege who, I had to be like woken up to my thin privilege, to my white privilege. Like these were things, right? Because when I look out into the world, all the images I see, I'm reflected in those. So I never thought about this before. So I think that was a big turning point for me. And I also find that in working with clients, it does help them to, it's like, okay, it's not a problem with like you or your body. It's a problem with our society and it's a problem with our culture. And doing that zoom out, I think can be really, really helpful too.
Yeah. Cause there's a lot of shame. I'm learning, like
Yes.
I'm learning to unpack my own thin privilege, but there's a lot of shame in being in a large body. And we are taught to believe that we, one, can control it, and two, should do everything that we can to control it. And I want to talk about the thin privilege a little bit before we move on, because it's something that I'm learning more and more about, because even though we all live under diet culture's influence, right? I have struggled with body image my whole life and dieting behavior my whole life, but I don't have that lived experience of being in a larger body. And I'm just waking up to the stigma and the shame that is shown to people in a larger body. And like you say, with posting that picture of the sandwich and getting all kinds of kudos and you're so brave, but your fat friends posting a similar photo being just judged and picked on and bullied, like, oh wow, like how can we as women living in a thin body use our voice to advocate for those who are being shamed and stigmatized against?
Yeah, that's such a good question. I think even just backing up a little bit for folks listening who, hearing the words like thin privilege, because this was
Yeah.
something, again, like
Yeah.
I didn't learn about until just the last few years. And I know also too, like the word privilege can often make people like kind of bristle a little bit,
Sure. Yeah.
especially when we've had our own like issues with food and body image. It can be like, well, it can feel almost like, well, you're saying like my suffering wasn't real. And it's like,
Right.
no, that's not what it is.
Yeah.
People of all sizes in our culture struggle with food and body image for the reasons, many of the reasons I just listed. But what thin privilege means is that, you are not, there's these different systems of oppression that exist in our society. And your body size isn't something, you're not oppressed by society because of your body size. So for
Right.
example, some examples of thin privilege, I can get on a plane and not worry about, is the seatbelt going to fit around my waist? Or am I going to have to buy 2 plane tickets to, fit in these tiny seats? I can walk into any restaurant and know that a chair is going to hold me and I'm going to fit. I can go into any store and find clothes that fit me. I can go into the doctor's office and know that, no matter what I go in there with, they're not going to blame it on my weight. Like they're going to really like get to the root of what's going on.
Yeah.
I have clients that like went in with an earache and like left with recommendations to lose weight, and so all of these things, like I can struggle personally with my body image, but when I go out into the world, I'm not, oppressed because of that. And I have advantages given to me because I'm in a thin body, oftentimes too, I think the word straight sized can be more appropriate because often people can be, straight sized, meaning in the US, at least, that's like up through size like 12 to 14 and below is considered straight size. So you can be, I have many clients who are a size, like wear a size 10 or 12 and they don't feel thin, but technically they do have this thin privilege.
That's
so you can also not feel thin and still have the thin privilege.
Yeah.
And I think, and again, this isn't to like invalidate anybody's experience, and body image issues impact people of all sizes, but we are not, those of us who are in straight size bodies aren't targets of like the structural or like institutional sizeism. And yeah, I think as I've, just come around to learning more about it, trying to, just like small things of like on social media, I actually don't post many photos of like my whole body. If I do post photos of myself, it's more just like, chest up or like head shots. But I actually try to not post photos of my body because I know that even if my intention is not to make someone feel less than or compare themselves to me, like that still happens.
For sure.
I try to, on my website, I like redid all the photos on my website to show a variety of different body sizes. Same thing like with photos I use in social media. And just trying to speak out more about it. And, because whether or not it's fair, which it's not, I am listened to and respected more often than fat providers, who have more experience than me, but like, because I'm in a thin body, people listen. So just trying to, use this privilege that I've been given unfairly. Like I didn't do any, like, this is my body. Like I was born like this. I didn't do anything to quote, deserve this or, something that I did, but it still exists. So yeah, just trying to do what I can to raise awareness and to talk about
Absolutely.
these issues, and to also, yeah, like pass the mic and like pull, use the privilege that I've been given to like advocate for people of all body sizes.
Yeah, I love that. Okay, so then back to unapologetic eating. What do you actually mean by that? What is unapologetic eating?
Such a good question. So it was interesting when I was writing this book. I actually did not know for most of the writing process. I still didn't have a title. Like I didn't know what I was going to call it. And then as I like kept writing, I realized that there's this like underlying theme of a lot of just like questioning everything and really like getting back into your body, and really getting back to like who you were before these social influences or societal influences kind of told you who you should be or who you're supposed to be. And so to me, that's what unapologetic eating is like getting back to that place and, eating what you want, when you want, how you want, without feeling guilty, without feeling ashamed, without feeling like you have to justify or apologize. It's that photo that I shared of me with the sandwich where like, I'm just like in the moment. I am just like enjoying that sandwich so much without worrying like what people are thinking. There's like food on my face. It's like a little messy, like very real, like fully like in my body and like just in that moment. And without feeling self-conscious or like worrying about others, just like being yourself with food and eating. And then really, and this is, this was what I really wanted to get through with the book, is that how when we go from, as we like heal our relationship to food and with our body, so many other things in our life open up. And so really it's, one of my early readers and endorsers said to me, she's like, okay, this is unapologetic eating, but really it's unapologetic living.
Yeah.
So that's kind of what I was trying to get with the book is, there's some really amazing books in the non-diet or anti-diet space, but trying to kind of show how it can start with food as this entry point to really just learning more about yourself and like who you are and what you want out of life, and being able to do so and like live an authentic life without feeling the need like you have to explain yourself.
Yeah, I love that. And I've often felt that myself, that food is just a metaphor for the whole way that we live, right? I love that. I have a question that often comes up in my world. Most of the people who come to me would say that they don't identify as dieters. I never have followed a diet, but then we dig into it and I find that like you say, they have a cheat day, right? They eat, quote, healthy all week, and then they allow themselves their cheat day on Friday night, or they restrict carbohydrates, or they don't eat after 6 p.m., or they intermittent fast in some way, shape, or form. So can you talk to me about the difference between these food, or what we're really doing when we have all these food rules, and how an intuitive eating approach can be a more gentle way to live and relate to your body?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So, it does get tricky because often people do think of diets as these like, well, keto or Atkins or Weight Watchers or something like that. And well, yes, those are diets. It's more than just that. And anything like all the stuff you just mentioned, like the cutting out certain foods or food groups, feeling like you have to control your portions or like, quote, watch what you're eating or not have too much, or, all of these behaviors are dieting, because no matter what, if it's called like wellness or a lifestyle change or anything like that, whenever it involves needing some type of like external control, and like the hope or promise of weight loss, then it's a diet.
Or even without weight loss, there's the hope of being healthier.
Yeah. I was just about to say like there's often this like, well, I'm doing it for my health.
Yeah.
And like really when I start to unpack that with people, this goes back to this, another belief in our society, our fat phobic society, of like health equals thin or health equals weight loss. And so, if there's still kind of that hope, whether it's conscious or whether like, it is more that subconscious of like losing weight, or of even just like gaining like control over your eating or your body, then like that is still dieting.
Yeah. Now, I have a lot of people who will say, I'll talk to them about intuitive eating as the antidote to this dieting behavior. But then the rebuttal that comes very quickly is, well, I don't trust myself around food. Like if I'm not following a plan, I won't be able to stop. I won't be able to control myself. So can you talk to me a little bit about that?
Yeah. So, well, that feeling is so real and valid. But what I say to that is, so the reason that you feel like you can't trust yourself, or the reason that you feel out of control around food, is because you're on a plan, or is because you are trying to control yourself. So, our bodies are biologically wired to keep us alive, and they are biologically wired still from thousands of years ago when food was more scarce. And so even though nowadays, for those of us who are food secure and have like plenty of food options around, if there's any kind of hint or sign or actual like restriction, our bodies interpret that as starvation, or as, oh, starvation's coming. So, and anytime they anytime they feel this like starvation or a starvation is coming, like a great example of that is like, oh, like this weekend's been so bad, I got to start over on Monday. And then what usually happens is, or when people go to like start a new diet, there's often that like the last supper kind of thing of like getting it all in, because your body is literally like, oh, starvation's coming, like got to get it in now. But biologically, that's actually what is happening in your body. Like your body thinks, even though you're not starving, like your body interprets any type of like food rules and restriction as starvation, or starvation is coming. So it increases your appetite. It increases fat storage. It decreases your metabolism. It increases cravings. Again, because your body is trying to keep you alive. And so that's actually your body doing what it is supposed to and working in the right way. So, and that is why people find that like, oh, well, if I stop my plan, then I just like boomerang to the other side. And it is this like restrict, binge kind of pendulum.
Yeah.
But once you let go of this restriction, then you're not going to boomerang over to that binge side. You fall like in the middle. Yeah. And now that takes some time.
Sure.
And yes, when you first do like allow yourself to eat what you want or keep foods around that you've been keeping off limits, yeah, you are going to eat a lot of those because you haven't been around them. And so they are this like new, exciting thing. And that's why if there is still any like, oh, I got to get back on track, or, oh, this is so bad. Like, again, your body's interpreting that as restriction. So a lot of people are like, well, I'm stocking my house. I'm like letting myself eat ice cream, cookies, chips, whatever. But then they still have the mental restriction going of like, oh, this is bad. I shouldn't be doing it. And so the body is still getting that like restricted message. And yeah, it's really going through this period of building back this trust so that your body knows, okay, they're going to let me eat what I want when I want. They're going to feed me every time I'm hungry. They're not going to be like, oh, dinner is like an hour or two away. Like, I'm just going to wait. Or like, oh, I just ate something I shouldn't eat again. Because that your body is like, oh, I don't know when they're going to eat again. So then like the next time you do eat, that's why you end up, often eating past this point of fullness. Yeah. So like really building back that body trust, and habituating to these foods being around, because the more they're around, then they lose their power. But once you kind of like go through this process, which takes a while, it's not just like a week or 2 weeks, like this can take a while, depending on how long you've been restricting or kind of like keeping things off limits. But yeah, everyone gets through this, and then you come out the other side. And then that's really where it's like, okay, yeah, like I can have these things around and eat them when I want them, but I'm listening to my body cues and I'm not kind of like going off the rails.
Yeah. Yeah. I love that. And I've experienced it myself. So I can validate that everything that you're saying is true. But I love how you talk in the book, how it's this whole system of unlearning, right? Everything that we have learned our whole life as what is right and wrong about food and weight and size and all of that, we really have to unlearn it. And I love how you mentioned that, self-care and having coping tools and self-compassion are so important throughout the process, and having a system of support. So can you share a little more about how that can help as you're unlearning?
Yeah, definitely. So this process of going from, trying to fix yourself or trying to change your body or trying to control your body to like allowing your body to just be, and to tuning more into your body signals, to feeling into your body to know like, okay, what do I need food wise, movement wise, stress management wise, coping wise, et cetera. It's a really hard process because like what we talked about before, like we live in this very fat phobic, like anti-fat bias society.
Mm-hmm.
So it's really hard. And especially, I know a lot of my clients are like the only one in their lives that are like doing this process. And so it can feel very like lonely and like you're kind of going against the tide. And so it is really important to have some type of support system in place because this is not an easy process. I always say, you know, it's the opposite of dieting in so many ways, including in the way of like dieting and like following a plan feels really easy at first because you're like, great, I just need to do what this says. It can feel very like I'm in control. I've got this. I just follow this plan. But then over time, that tends to get harder and harder, right? Because like life gets in the way. And like, you know, again, like what I mentioned before, we can only have this kind of restriction for so long before we boomerang back to the binging or the out of control feeling around food.
Yeah.
And then, you know, the intuitive eating process or this process of kind of like coming back into your body, it's the opposite. It is very difficult at first because most of us have been living a lot up in our heads and eating based on these external kind of rules and factors for so long that it's a process of getting back into our bodies and building back that trust again. But it gets easier and easier over time. Yeah. So having a support system in place of people who are on this same journey is so important. I think too, you mentioned the like the self-care. I have a whole chapter on like self-care and coping tools, because in this process, as we're going through, you know, unpacking all of our beliefs and our thoughts and feelings and thinking about like, because yeah, as you mentioned, everything we like think we know about food, about bodies, about health, about weight, it was all something we were taught at one point or another. And so much of this process is really unpacking, like, when did I learn that? How did I come to like these beliefs? And like, are they either true or untrue, but also are these like actually helping me?
Yeah.
And so it is unwinding and like unlearning a lot of that. And when you do that, I call myself a nutrition therapist. Like I'm a dietitian, but I use the term nutrition therapist a lot because it really is like therapy, but specifically like to the like the food and body image piece, because, you know, struggling with food or, you know, struggling with your body image, that's not actually the problem. Like that's a symptom of the problem underneath. And so when you start to unpack that and go deeper, lots of thoughts and feelings rise to the surface. And for a lot of people, like these are feelings that they've been stuffing down for years because it's really tough to deal with. Yeah. So, you know, having a support system in place, having like a self-care plan and like coping tools to help you as you move through these feelings is so important.
Yeah, I really love that you brought that up because like you say, it can be very confronting when you start to challenge core beliefs that you've held for your whole life. And especially in a society, like you say, that doesn't agree, right? Totally. Trying to challenge the status quo of all this fat phobia and diet culture that's out there. It's hard work. So I know I very much needed a system of support when I was going through it. And I'm really thankful that you brought that up and that those supports do exist. I think we could talk for a lot longer, but I do want to start to wrap this up. So much has come out of this conversation and I have learned so much, but I want to ask you one final question, which is about the last chapter of your book called Embracing Your Power. I just even love the title of that chapter. So what does that mean to you and how might it be different than how power is traditionally thought of in our society?
Yeah, I'm so glad you asked this question. That was one of my favorite chapters to write, actually, which was interesting because when I was doing my outline of the book, so my book is in 4 sections and that last section is growing. And I had like 3 bullet points and all the other sections had like dozens of bullet points. And so I was like, ooh, I know where I want to go with this, but I'm not really sure what I'm gonna be writing about. But yeah, so that last chapter about embracing your power, you know, in our white supremacist patriarchal society, power is usually conflated with like power over one another and like very individual of like individual success and really like getting closer to those in privileged positions. I actually didn't include this in the book because I didn't learn about it till after I finished, but I talk about this all the time now because Sonia Renee Taylor she was on Brene Brown's podcast and it's an amazing episode if you have not listened to it. But Sonia Renee Taylor talks about the ladder, like the body hierarchy ladder and how like white men are at the top and then goes all the way down, basically like Black trans women at the bottom with like everybody in between. And the way power is structured in our society where like the white men at the top hold it, we've been conditioned to think of like, okay, in order to get this power that they're holding, I have to climb up this ladder and like climb over other people. So it becomes this like power over other people. And still at the end of the day, like continues to uphold these systems of oppression that there's always then people below you on the ladder.
Yeah.
And so Sonia Renee Taylor talks about in that episode, like, okay, we have to get rid of this ladder altogether. And that was really my idea around, you know, reframing empowerment as not empower over one another, but really this empowered to like challenge the status quo and dismantle these systems of oppression and go against this like tide wave. You know, so I really talk about in that last chapter, different ways that how that might look for you, like how you can start to be more empowered to like take up space, not just like physical space, but like mental and emotional space. Empowered to like let go of these expectations that have been put on you by society and like live your most like authentic life. Empowered to say no to things that you don't want to do and just empowered to really trust yourself. Yes, around food, but like once you start to trust yourself around food, and this was really like when I was thinking about writing a book, this was my initial idea, was about how, you know, it starts with food for a lot of people and like healing our relationship to food. We trust ourselves around food. We become liberated of like not feeling like controlled by food. We then start to trust ourselves in so many other aspects of our life as well. And so that really is that like empowerment to me of just being able to trust yourself, like live the life that you want to live without feeling like you need to like ask for permission or offer explanation or like apologize for that.
Well, it's very inspiring. And I mean, though the book is called Unapologetic Eating, I can already see how it could just transform every facet of your life. And I can't wait to dive deeper and read the whole thing. And I mean, those of you listening, go buy the book right now. So Alissa, can you just to finish up, can you tell our listeners how they can access your book and how they can keep in touch with you after this episode?
Sure. So my book, Unapologetic Eating, is available basically wherever books are sold for the most part. So it's on Amazon. It's available through Bookshop, IndieBound. For people who may be international or outside of the US and Canada, you can get it on bookdepository.com. And then otherwise you are welcome to connect with me. My website is alissarumsey.com. And I spend a lot of time over on Instagram at AlissaRumseyRD.
Okay. And I will link to all of that in the show notes as well. So people have it. Alissa, I thank you so much for being here today and sharing all of your wisdom. I know I learned a lot just in this short conversation. I'm sure it will be valuable to my listeners as well. So thank you once again for being willing to share your expertise with us.
Of course. Thank you so much for having me on. I really appreciate it.
Well, wasn't that something? That interview gave me so much to think about and reflect on. I'm sure it did for you too. I think what I really love is that I now have a deeper understanding of all the pressure and guilt I've felt for so many years about food and weight. And now I can really see that none of that was my fault. And empowered with this knowledge, I can now step into my power and be a voice for change. I'd love to know what your takeaways were, so you can send me a DM on Instagram or comment on any of my social media posts about this episode. And go show Alissa some love. Follow her social channels and go buy the book. The Amazon link for Unapologetic Eating is in the show notes. So that's it for today. Next week, I'll be joined by another great guest. Dr. Maggie Landis, MD, is going to be coming to talk to us about health and weight and what it actually means to be healthy at any size. So until next week, my friends, thank you so much for being part of this community. And remember that you can connect with me on Instagram and Facebook at Radiant Vitality Wellness. And you can learn more about how to work with me on my website at radiantvitality.ca. Be well, friends, and here's to your Radiant Vitality. Hey, before you go, I just want to tell you how grateful I am for you. It means the world to me that you're part of our Radiant Vitality community. I've got a free gift for you. Head on over to my website and download the Motivation Secret, the simple mindset shift that will get you off the start-stop cycle for good. The link is in the show notes. And hey, if you enjoy this podcast, the greatest gift you could give me is to leave a review or share this episode with a friend. Your shares and reviews help move our show up the rankings on the podcast directories so that it can be seen by more women just like you who are ready for something different with fitness. Bye for now, friend.